Nigeria's foreign policy since independence has been followed up within the framework that ensures that Africa remains and maintains its leadership role and her direct influence in the pursuit of her national goals and objectives. Since independence, Nigeria has continued to occupy the center stage of African affairs, using her vast resources, influence, and power to achieve this aspiration and further her national interest, especially in the West African sub-region. How has Nigeria's foreign policy evolved over the years? And how have these policies affected diplomatic ties among a committee of nations? Today on the program, we have a guest who is an experienced diplomat and has vast knowledge in Nigeria's foreign policy. Let me welcome Ambassador Usman Sarki, former Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations and a former Directing Staff at the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies. Welcome to the program, sir. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on the program. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go straight into the questions. And I would ask you firstly, how would you assess the implementation of Nigeria's foreign policy since independence?
Thank you very much. This is a very important question. Foreign policy in Nigeria since independence is a very broad and wide-ranging subject. Scholars, academics, journalists, and people interested in foreign policy have actually written extensively on that. And the general consensus is to categorize the implementation of foreign policy along the epochs or eras of different administrations, beginning from the Tafawa Balewa administration in 1960 to 66. In that era, it was mainly the conceptualization, crystallization, and nurturing of Nigerian state as a post-independence entity with the trappings of sovereignty, which actually necessitated the drawing up of foreign policy constructs for the country. As a post-colonial country or state, Nigeria was consolidating its integrity and among the independence of the country in those days was necessarily geared towards establishing our space in the African region and the global community. And that means developing our capacity for multilateral diplomacy, first of all, by joining the United Nations, and also by creating the Organization of African Union, African Unity, and also crystallizing and conceptualizing and creating other global organizations like the Non-Aligned Movement. So it was a formative period, 1960s to 66, that saw to the elaboration of the contours of foreign policy. Let me remind your viewers and all of us that on 7th October 1960, our first Prime Minister, late Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, addressed the United Nations General Assembly. In his speech, he delineated and outlined the core elements of Nigeria's foreign policy, which actually basically became the national interest issues or elements of Nigeria's foreign policy up till today. And the outlines of those issues have been captured in the 1999 Constitution under Section 2, Chapter 2 of the Constitution. So those issues that Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa outlined were mainly along the lines of foreign policy being deployed to actualize, concretize, and defend Nigeria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, first and foremost. Secondly, to create conditions for peaceful coexistence with neighboring countries and also protecting and respecting the borders and territorial integrity of other countries. Thirdly, to pronounce categorically Nigeria has peaceful intentions only towards all other countries and entities. We have no territorial ambitions. We have no issues with other countries that will make us go to war with them. Fourthly, to respect the Charter of the United Nations in terms of maintenance, contributing to the maintenance of peace and international order and security. The idea of protecting the integrity of Black people, particularly in those days when many African countries were under colonial and racist regimes, became a very important component of Nigeria's foreign policy. The other issue was to pursue the well-being of Nigerians in terms of the economic interest, security, prosperity, and development of our country. So those core elements around which the national interests were formulated stood the test of time, and they apply right up to today under all administrations or regimes in the country, be they military or civilians. And they have stood the test of times in terms of the integrity of the concepts behind them. After the First Republic, there were no dramatic shifts really in Nigeria's foreign policy, as some people may wish to argue, but a continuation of this structure that has been set up by Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa in terms of protection of Nigeria's integrity. So the Civil War was a big challenge for Nigeria in terms of the way it brought about the new realities of the world to our leaders in terms of the Cold War in those years between the Western countries and the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc, and in terms of the carving out of spheres of influence by the powerful countries. So Nigeria was to be a victim of the Cold War and the carving out of spheres of influence. But our foreign policy responded to the challenge and created a group of countries that were friendly to us and that respected the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Nigeria. And they came to our support, both diplomatically, politically, economically, and militarily. And through the dexterity of the leaders in those days, led by General Yakubu Gowon and others, our foreign policy really responded by creating the conditions necessary for the defense of our security, of our territorial integrity and independence. We overcame the challenge of the Civil War largely because of the engagement with countries who supplied us with diplomatic and military wherewithal to fight the Civil War. After the Civil War, Nigeria's foreign policy actually was aimed at consolidation of our independence and integrity, and also of bringing into the fold the enclave that wanted to break away, and to tell the whole world that we are brothers and sisters, there was no vanquish and there was no victor. And because of that framework, peace gradually returned to the areas where the Civil War took place, and then rehabilitation, reconstruction, and reintegration became a policy of the federal government in terms of gathering foreign support to be brought to the country, such as in terms of humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, and so forth. Now, after that, the main challenge for the government or the administration in those days was actually how to rise up to the challenge of decolonization of the continent, and also of standing up to the white supremacist apartheid regime in South Africa, to bring an end to that obnoxious system of apartheid and to decolonize countries still under foreign colonial rule, namely Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde, and so forth. So that became the preoccupation of our foreign policy continuously without a break, be it at the multilateral level in the United Nations or at the bilateral level with other countries. You remember in 1984, the administration actually took the very bold step of nationalizing some foreign companies, particularly Shell, BP, British Petroleum, and Standard Bank in those days, to protest and to act decisively against the United Kingdom for its open, apparent, and unashamed and unabashed support for the apartheid regime under Margaret Thatcher. So that became a defining moment in Nigeria's foreign policy. In 1994, we succeeded in toppling the apartheid regime, plus the other frontline countries and the South African, the ANC, and freedom fighters. And subsequently, countries like Namibia, Angola, Zimbabwe, Mozambique became independent. And that closed the chapter of Nigeria's assertive foreign policy in terms of standing up to the Western imperialist countries and governments. The next chapter in Nigeria's foreign policy was the consolidation of African unity, creating the structures of unity, and also establishment of the regional grouping, ECOWAS, in the 1970s, which now we turn our attention to in order to make ECOWAS one of the building blocks of the integration and unity of Africa. And we maintain, for instance, Nigeria is the main financier of ECOWAS budget, actually. We pay about 60% of the budget of ECOWAS. And ECOWAS headquarters, the secretariat is established here in Abuja, and we support the ECOWAS parliament, and we participate actively in the decision-making process and implementation of policies in the ECOWAS region. We became the main supplier of military force to the ECOWAS intervention force in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea-Bissau in the form of ECOMO. That brought to an end the very murderous, brutal civil war, particularly in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We became also very active in terms of establishing the normative framework for democratic governance, constitutional government, and civil rule in ECOWAS by framing and adopting various protocols and mechanisms towards ensuring democratic governance in the region. In the wider African context, we became involved with closer relationship with North African countries and countries of other parts of the African continent at bilateral levels, and also engaging in peacekeeping and deployment of our forces in places like the Congo, Darfur, and other places where conflicts were raging. We also contributed towards the development of the structures of the Organization of African Union and participated in its transition from the OAU to the African Union in, I think, 2002, which became a very critical initiative in terms of focusing the idea of African unity based on creating the political, security, and economic conditions for the integration of the continent. And that led to the adoption of issues like the African Continental Free Trade Area, the policy of adoption of a common passport and identity papers for African countries, the monetary union in ECOWAS, and also the African common currency. And on a larger framework, we also participated in the adoption of the Continental Development Framework, which became known as the African Union Agenda 2063, whereby by that date, it is expected that Africa will transit from its present economic condition to a higher level of economic development, whereby the integration of the continent will continue, will be deepened and reinforced, and the economies of the continent will be harmonized along defined lines of development, financing, power, construction, and also uplifting the human conditions in the continent. The other framework we contributed towards adoption is the Program of Infrastructure Development in Africa, or PIDA, P-I-D-A, which actually provided the normative framework for development of infrastructure in Africa. So you can see from 1960 to this very moment, our foreign policy has been dynamic, active, not necessarily assertive in terms of radicalism, but consistency towards respecting the Charter of the United Nations to maintain international peace and security, international law and order, and in our region, in Africa, to really contribute to the stability of the region, the security of the region, economic development of our region, and advancing democracy. So it has been very interesting, although checkered in some ways, but under all the regimes and governments and administrations in Nigeria, there is one main thread that runs through our foreign policy, that of African unity, that of territorial integrity of African states, peace and security, social and economic development, the protection of the dignity and respect of the African person, and also ending oppression wherever they may exist, whether by colonial powers or occupation powers such as in Western Sahara or in Palestine. So these are the elements in a nutshell or broadly of Nigeria's foreign policy, posture from independence to today. Wow. And of course, today we have the president, His Excellency Bola Ahmed Tinubu, GCFR, as the chairman of ECOWAS, which is a manifestation of the continuity of Nigeria's foreign policy.
Wow. That was a very, very detailed, a detailed process of Nigeria's foreign policy since independence. Very, very detailed. So I would want to ask, what would you consider as the internal and external factors shaping Nigeria's foreign policy?
Well, thank you. That is another very important question. I think it is very important for us to understand what foreign policy is in responding to this question. Without being pedantic or academic in defining foreign policy, I would like to say that foreign policy mainly is an attribute of a state or a country. You cannot conduct foreign policy if you are not independent, if you don't have a defined territory, and if you don't have the attribute of sovereignty. So foreign policy actually encapsulates the essences of a state: sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and the capacity to enter into treaties with other countries, other governments, and international organizations. So the conduct of foreign policy is the highest act of state, the highest attribute of a country or a state, and the single most important determinant of the credentials of a country. As such, your question is very important in terms of the internal and external determinants of our foreign policy. The internal determinants of our foreign policy, first and foremost, are the normative processes, that is, the legal scope of the existence of our country. Being a sovereign and independent country with defined borders, we have to now situate and contextualize our foreign policy on the legal framework. And what is that legal framework? It is the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. We have had several constitutions since the 1950s up to 1999, which is the operative constitution of our country. So the relevant articles of that constitution under Chapter 2 have defined the framework in which Nigeria's foreign policy is conducted. The president and commander-in-chief is the chief architect of Nigeria's foreign policy in terms of the executive powers under which the foreign policy of the country is executed. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, largely, primarily, and mainly, is the institutional expression of the conduct and implementation of Nigeria's foreign policy. So the internal dynamics in Nigeria are as follows. First, conduct of foreign policy is by the laws of our country, and commander-in-chief is the main foreign policy person or determinant of the country at any given time, because that falls under his purview as an executive function of state. Thirdly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as the statutory body charged with the conduct of foreign policy, the implementation of foreign policy, and the negotiation and signing of treaties with other countries, other governments, other states, and other international organizations is the main body that shapes the implementation of foreign policy. So these three factors, constitutionalism, the presidency, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are the main internal determinants of Nigeria's foreign policy. Beyond this, we have other actors that may be not frontline in terms of their responsibilities and functions, but they also contribute, to the ingredients of foreign policy in Nigeria. What are these actors? Number one, they are other ministries of government, like the Ministry of Justice, like the Ministry of Defense, and others also contribute to the shaping of Nigeria's foreign policy. Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, because you find complementary agencies and organizations such as in the United Nations and in African Union that deal with these issues. So our national policies on agriculture or health, for instance, emanate from the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Health. And that cascades into our foreign policy when we are dealing with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations based in Rome, for instance, or the policies on health in Nigeria emanating from the Federal Ministry of Health will dovetail with the World Health Organization's formula for maintaining public health, such as responding to pandemics, as we witnessed in 2022, 2022, with the outbreak of COVID. So that was a national issue, but reflective of the global situation. The Ministry of Health was the driver, but it now has to dovetail with our foreign policy when we were engaging with World Health Organizations, with China, with the European Union, with other African countries, with the Nigerian Immigration Service, and so forth. So the internal determinants are many. Civil society, the Nigerian Manufacturers Association, religious bodies, and others all contribute to the shaping of Nigeria's policy. One main element of the internal factor is the media. Media also plays a very important role in generating discussions, debates, and general outlooks on foreign policy by asking questions and raising issues for discussion. We have seen how the coup in Niger in July generated a lot of discussions in Nigeria in the media, including even religious leaders, traditional leaders coming out to contribute to the discourse, the discussion. So this is in the internal dimension. And let us not forget the contribution of specialized institutions like the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies, NIPSS in Kuru, Jos, that actually contributes to the defining of policy, crystallization of policy, public policy in Nigeria, including foreign policy. And the Nigerian Institute for International Affairs in Lagos, NIIA, and various other agencies on public policy. They also contribute towards the determining of the direction of Nigerian foreign policy by giving advice. Now, what are the external determinants of Nigerian foreign policy? Well, these are factors over which we have no control, for instance, but in which we can contribute towards the shaping and progress of policies that emanate from those institutions, for instance, the United Nations, the African Union, the Economic Community of West African States, and so forth. Those are external bodies, but as members of those bodies, we have the prerogative as an independent country, sovereign country, to contribute to the deliberations in those institutions and organs, to formulate their policies, and even contribute to the implementation of decisions taken. That is called multilateralism. And the other determinant of external determinant is the disposition and attitudes of other countries towards us. Peaceful conduct of international relations is the basis of the United Nations Charter. Therefore, all countries that engage with us must come from the position of peaceful coexistence and peaceful relationship with Nigeria, non-aggressive intent that will not undermine our sovereignty, territorial integrity, peace and security, and independence. So the external factors are both bilateral and multilateral in terms of how we engage with international organizations and members of those organizations, and also in terms of how we respond to the relationship overtures made to us by other countries. There are external factors also that are beyond our control, but to which we must respond. Actually, the threat posed by terrorist organizations, militant organizations, non-state actors that are armed to the teeth, that are fighting us and trying to change the course of our policy and outlook as a nation. The Boko Haram terrorist insurgency in Borno and the rest of the Northeast, for instance, mainly can be seen as an external as well as an internal challenge to which the Nigerian state responded over the last 12 or 15 years. So issues like security in the Sahel and the Chad Basin, issues like climate change, issues like trafficking in persons, illicit supply and flow of small arms and light weapons, money laundering, illegal migration. These are external factors that shape our foreign policy in terms of responding to them and seeking an aggregate of views and opinions of other countries around us and even in far-flung corners of the world to join our efforts in order to fight those negative tendencies and forces, to restore confidence in the international system, and also to protect our own national interests.
That was very, very in-depth. And you also answered part of the question, part of my next question, which was how have our foreign policies over the years impacted on our influence in the international community? So I want to ask again that since independence, Nigeria's foreign policy has been characterized by a focus on Africa. And this is expected by Nigeria's big brother role in the continent. How would you react to that responsibility, sir?
Yes, our size, the number of the population of our country, our economic endowment, and also physical location makes it imperative or make it imperative that Nigeria assumes a responsibility commensurate with the demands of the circumstances in West Africa and Africa to be a leading country in particularly providing guidance and focus towards establishing conditions for good governance in Africa and also aggregating economic development. Let me take us back to as far as 1980 or 1982, when the Lagos Plan of Action for Economic Development in Africa was adopted. That was a very critical decision or meeting, which came out of the meeting of heads of state and government of African countries in Lagos. That time, Lagos, of course, the capital, the headquarters of the Nigerian government. The document outlined strategies towards the industrialization of Africa, the economic development of Africa, and making Africa a self-sustaining region within the larger global economic community. The fact that the meeting took place in Lagos established the economic credentials of Nigeria as the economic powerhouse of Africa. And at that time, some countries like South Africa were not independent. They were under apartheid regime, Namibia and Zimbabwe, Angola, and so forth. So the idea was for us to now move away from seeking political independence, although that is very critical, towards consolidating the resources of Africa. And they saw Nigeria as the country that would lead in that direction. So The virtue of our economy placed this automatic leadership requirement on us, keeping capacity, military, in the whole world in those days. And it became incumbent for us to lead in providing peace and security, stability, and combating armed insurgency and breakaway factions in other parts of Africa. And we provided that to a reasonable extent since 1960, when first we went into the Congo to keep the peace, and we continued that up to 2015, I think, or thereabout, when we left Darfur. So those elements, those requirements, those perceptions placed an automatic responsibility on Nigeria to lead West Africa and the rest of Africa. And I think Nigerians should not shy away from that responsibility, because this is a providential responsibility placed upon us by our location. Number one, we are Africans. We cannot help that. We cannot run away from that. We cannot avoid that. Number two, we are the largest population. We have the largest population in Africa. We cannot deny that. And number two, we have the largest economy in Africa. We cannot run away from that. And number three, our military is the largest and the most experienced and the most up-to-date in terms of equipment, training, discipline in Africa. We cannot deny that. So these three or four factors will automatically place a demand on us to live up to the responsibilities and expectations of other African countries, particularly those that are not as well endowed as we are, to provide leadership. Now, at the United Nations also, if you remember, since 1964 or thereabout, we have been coming into the UN Security Council more frequently and more regularly than other countries. The last time we were there was 2014, 2015, when I was also in New York in the permanent mission. So we continue to create, to perform very, very constructive and indispensable responsibilities and discharge some functions towards the articulation and advancement of Africa's interests in the United Nations. Our place in the African Union Peace and Security Council also makes it imperative that we provide leadership in the peace and security dimension in Africa. Our role in other organizations globally entail that we are seen as the spokesperson for Africa and the Black race. And most importantly, being the biggest, the largest, the single most important concentration of Black people in the world. It is our responsibility and duty to speak up for the dignity, integrity, interest, and respect of race. And that is what we should do, and that is one of the cornerstones of Nigeria's foreign policy and the pillars of our foreign policy and national and global outlook.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Usman Seriki. It's been delightful talking with you, and thank you for your insightful contributions. We hope to have you again.
Keep watching.
Keep watching.
Keep watching NIPSS Policy TV.
Well, I think really coup is not the order of the day for now, even though there are some coups taking place in Africa. I don't subscribe to coups. We have come a long way. And if they begin to happen today, then it means there's some problem somewhere. And we need to get to understand that. No matter how bad a democracy is, it's still more preferable than having a military coup. It's abnormal to have a military coup when we have advanced in terms of democracy. But when they begin to happen, then we begin to interrogate why do they happen. So I think there are major challenges that makes people to begin to think. And it has to do with if democracy is not giving people what they want, they begin to think about what other option. And because we have been in under military regime for a very long period. People don't think outside the box to think what else apart from military coup. And that's what is informing people thinking that, look, we can change government, we can improve government through military coup, but it doesn't happen. I mean, it's not the best option. But for it to be happening, particularly African leaders, they need to go to the boardroom and begin to think what is responsible. It means, to some extent, we are not delivering on good governance. If we are delivering on good governance, if we are addressing issues of poverty, inclusivity, and you are responsible to the people, accountability is there, why should people think about coup? To an extent that people are celebrating coup in some of the countries in Africa. So something must be wrong with our democracy, and that's why we are having that kind of challenge. Yeah, yes, leadership to a large extent is responsible for what is happening. When you have people after winning elections, they want to stay longer than what is prescribed in the Constitution. When you have leaders who manipulate elections so that they will be in office, of course, it's a major challenge. Or when you have leaders who claim that they were called by their people to represent them, and they were elected by people to represent them, and they get there, they don't represent their interests, then certainly people will begin to look for alternative to how they can get them out of office. So generally, it's about failure of governance. When you don't meet the needs of the people, democracy is about people. It's about responsibility. I mean, people decided to say, okay, look, we're sacrificing part of our rights so that you can represent us. So when they sacrifice part of their right and you are there representing them, you become lord over them. No, it's not so. You are supposed to be a servant to them, but when you are not serving them, then it means there's a big challenge. It's very common with politicians. After election, you don't see them again until the next election. So they will wait for you. And if the election emperor are not transparent or they are being manipulated and the people cannot have the people they want, then of course you begin to have such kind of issues. Yeah, I think they come after elections because the election process might not be free and fair, and even the election umpire might not be independent as some of them have been called, and judiciary itself might be partisan, so people might want to either go violent or try to mobilize, or try to mobilize the military to see if they can also fight. Because it's about winner takes all. The person that wins, those who didn't win, they are not involved in the elections. And if in an election you have in a country that you have 50 million and only 10 million voted, and what do you do with the 40 million that is there? You still need to take them along so that they can be part of whatever you are doing. So when you ignore the people, of course, it becomes a major challenge. So governance is about involving the people. It's about the people. Whatever you're doing is about the people. The challenge is that in most of the African countries, the leadership selection process is a major challenge. In some countries, you discover that maybe when it comes to presidential election, you have only one sole candidate. Others are not given the opportunity to participate. So the selection process in most of the election is faulty, and therefore people deny opportunity to serve as leaders, and those who are not supposed to be leaders, they find themselves being leaders. In some of the African countries, some is hereditary. Your father was the president, your grandfather was the president, and you also have to be the president. So, of course, people get tired with that. Or somebody you are dear, you are like, take the issue of one of the neighboring countries, you have been dear, in terms of your health, you're not very healthy. People have to hold you, and yet you are holding tight to the office. So definitely there will be issues. So the leadership selection process is a bit faulty in Africa, and that affects us a lot. Well, the way forward for Nigeria, the way forward for Africa.
Africa, for Nigeria.
Yeah, Nigeria. For Nigeria, I would say, yes, we have made some progress in terms of democracy. Since 2019, we have been having elections. Yeah, there are disputes, there are issues and the rest of them, but I think we're still in a process, and it will continue to grow. And it's for us to keep on understanding ourselves and also knowing how to tackle some of those challenges. And particularly, like I mentioned earlier, in terms of selection process of our leaders is very, very key. Nigeria is, we have a lot of people who are capacity to lead this country in diverse way at the, national and subnational levels. We have so much resources to explore and the rest of them. So if we can keep aside all those so-called differences which has been keeping us apart, change our lenses instead of seeing things from a religious perspective. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a religious perspective. But what I mean is that when you give all those things give coloration to issues of national interest, it becomes a major challenge. So if we begin to see ourselves first as Nigerians and how we are thinking about what is best for Nigeria, it will help us a lot. When you have leaders who have visions, leaders who are not selfish, leaders who are passionate concerning how to move Nigeria forward, it will help us a lot. So I think one day we're getting there, and of course, utilizing the resources that we have, particularly the human resources, and the youth in particular. When you give them the best, they will also give you the best. But when you ignore your youth, then you are doomed. You are doomed. So we have to have a future for them in terms of education, in terms of employment, in terms of giving them space to participate in politics. They have great potential. And that's why when they move out of this country, they excel wherever they find themselves. So a lot of them that are involved in crime, it's not that they really want to be involved in crime, but when the environment doesn't allow them to release their potentials and contribute towards the development of the country, then it becomes a major challenge. So I can stop on that in terms of Nigeria, but Nigeria is a great nation, and when NIPSS begins to talk about towards a better society, that's the dream. That should be the dream of every leader. How should we make Nigeria comfortable? So even that those who are in diaspora begin to think about coming back home. And if we get acts together, I believe strongly that a lot of them that are in diaspora, they will begin to return home. And no nation in the world will be able to compete with Nigeria. No nation will be able to compete with Nigeria. So Nigeria is a great nation. I have confidence in Nigeria. Yes, we may have challenges, but we are a great nation, great people. And I strongly believe that not in the long distance, time, that we are going to have a great nation, and the whole world will know that we have a nation. For Africa, yes, I think it might be a move. And it might be a kind of calling on our leaders to sit up. When this thing begins to happen, it's a signal to other leaders to begin to think again of how they are leading their people. So it's a good thing it's happening, even though it's not that we are supporting military coup in Africa. But when people begin to challenge their leaders, then the leaders should be able to sit up. And if they don't sit up, it's not just about military coup, but even the people can rise up against them. So it can happen. It happens in other developed countries in the past, in France, in United States, and the rest of the uprising can come up that people will take their destiny in their hands. So I think our leaders in Africa should begin to think about the people rather than thinking about themselves building empire for themselves. Somebody said, when you build structures and you ignore the people will destroy the structures. But when you build the people will build the structures. So I think that should be our focus on building our people who will build our countries, our nations in Africa. So it's very, very key in terms of a new Africa. But I strongly believe a new Africa is emerging with all these challenges that are coming up.
Our foreign policy has been very robust from onset, from the beginning. Nigeria has played a very, very active role in foreign policy, covering Africa and the rest of the world. It's been very, very, but of recent, in the past few years, I've seen that there's a need for Nigeria to review that policy, to reposition the country for the goals and the objectives that the government intends to achieve in the future. Our foreign policy has impacted on our on us. It has impacted economically, and especially if we look at Africa. Nigeria has played a very prominent role in political activities within Africa. I remember in the days of apartheid, the roles Nigeria played, and West African countries, and of course, internationally speaking, Nigeria has also been involved and active in international scene. But of recent, our active role has dwindled. It hasn't been as it used to be.
Sir, what are the factors contributing to this dwindleness?
I want to think that the government, the leadership needs to review our foreign policy trust.
The current administration of His Excellency President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has taken a giant stride in leading Nigeria's foreign policy on the African continent. In so doing, we've seen recent escalation of coup d'etats on the African continent, and I think Mr. President has taken the lead by demonstrating leadership and courage to dialogue with the putschists in several African countries, Burkina Faso, I think Mali, I think Niger most recently. And Nigeria has been a major contributor in trying to bring peace and stability on the African continent, while on the international front, I believe Nigeria takes a neutral approach towards foreign policy issues. However, on the African continent, history has shown Nigeria has done quite a lot of work in Liberia in the past as it relates to the ECOMOG forces, and I think we'll continue to do that.
Sir, what can you say are the strengths and weaknesses of our own foreign policies?
Personally, I think the strength of foreign policy is in trying to handle continental issues. Nigeria has both the kinetic and non-kinetic power force to handle what it takes to bring about peace and stability in the African region, and as well as the ECOWAS sub-region. Nigeria is a major player. Secondly, economically, I believe Nigeria has the financial muscle to engage in bringing about peace and stability on the in the African sub-region. While from a weakness point of view, I think we need to do a lot more to see that we have a seat at the table in the international community. When I talk about the international community, I am talking about global bodies like the United Nations, the European Union. We need to have a seat at the table whereby we table African issues the way we see them from an African perspective, especially that Nigeria has the highest GDP in Africa. So is the largest economy in Africa, I think, followed by South Africa. So that gives us the opportunity to follow and see through an African agenda at the global center stage.
To assess the implementation of Nigerian foreign policy since independent inception, I would say fairly, in the sense that we've played a key role in the leadership of ECOWAS, and we've given a leadership. Given a leadership, but to an extent, I will still say we've not done as expected as a nation. To an extent, some of the policies that we as a nation have tried to emulate, we've not shown that strength. And at the point, you discover that we've not showed an example, because look at it, in our judiciary, we've not given the needed leadership that is expected from the judiciary. Compare our judicial system with that of other nations or other countries, you discover that we are very, very apart with them. And we were totally lacking behind, and we need to do a lot in that aspect as a country.
How have our foreign policies impacted on our influence in the international community?
Well, as a country that practice democracy, and as a country that have shown resilience, we have left the other pre-colonial activities into post-colonial era. And I believe our foreign policies have at a point impacted on us in a sense, at least to an extent where people that they respect us, despite our lapses as a nation. But if we go out, they respect us, they respect our leadership, because whenever a Nigerian is found outside, it displays that charisma, that strength of a leader, and he shows example outside there, and they perform very credibly well.
Keep watching.
Keep watching NIPSS Policy TV.
In conclusion, Nigeria's multilateral relations have a prominent position in Nigeria's foreign policy. Nigeria's membership in and commitment to several international organizations like the United Nations, the African Union, and the Commonwealth of Nations have impact on her foreign policy position. Looking at the history of Nigeria's foreign policy, there is no doubt that the foreign policy of any state is a product of environmental factors, both internal and external. These two factors condition our foreign policy from conception to formulation and implementation. That's all on our package for today. Thanks for joining us. I am Chana Ejoga. Bye for now.